let's get into the murder and mayhem in Wood County. Our first case that we're going to talk about today is the case of the murder of Granville Loomis from 1885. And I think that this story is really interesting because while it's 1885, I think that it's interesting the way a lot of the techniques that they use to solve the crime are very similar to things we hear on, crime shows like CSI and Law and Order even today. So it's kind of an early example of CSI techniques. So this case begins on May 9th in 1885 with a man named Gottlieb Schaefer, who is working with a hired hand on his brother's farm near Stony Ridge. And they're actually in the process of splitting wood to build a fence along the back of the property. And so they're splitting these logs and they're hauling them down to the back edge of the property. And on one of their trips with these logs, they see something down near the edge of the property. And so Gottlieb goes over to investigate it, and he thinks it's probably a dead animal or something. But when he gets closer, he discovered it is actually the mutilated body of a man. So he, of course, is very upset and startled by this, and he runs home to immediately call Sheriff Brown and the county coroner, and they come out to investigate. So during the investigation of the
I don't know if they
scene,
did. I'm talking to you already or not.
they are
It's
able
recorded, so we
to
can probably watch it again.
discover the following things. That the body is of a male from age 30 to 40 years old.
No, this is all the murders in Wood County.
The body has been damaged both by the crime that was committed, but also being left out to the elements for a couple of days. They do discover that the head of the victim has been badly damaged, they believe, by a large rock, which they find nearby. And they think that perhaps this was to hide the identity of the man. But they also discover that there are bruises on the neck, so they think that perhaps he was also choked. And they find a hat nearby that has bullet holes, so they think that perhaps he's also been shot.
Jeez.
So there's several ways that he has been injured. So they also examine the clothing and the shoes, and they see some grains that are kind of stuck in the soles of his shoes, and they're of a certain kind of plant that is in a nearby field. So they go to that field and they start investigating, and they find footprints of 3 different men that are leading up to the crime scene. So they think that he was led there on foot somehow, so he was alive when he entered the area. And then they find the most unusual detail of all. On his socks, there is a strip of white cloth with the words G.G. Loomis on this little piece of cloth. And this ends up being the key. So the Sentinel Tribune agrees to publish all of the details, the description of the man and the scene, in hopes of finding some information about this crime. And it works. The next week's paper reports that Sheriff Brown has been contacted by the family of a man named Granville G. Loomis, G.G. Loomis. And they say that he was in the area. They describe him as an eccentric, if not a little bit mad character. But they say that he was in the area conducting business with a man named Arthur Grover. And they agree with the assessment that perhaps his face was mutilated with the rock because he had a large scar on his face, which would have been easy to identify him with. So, and then also in addition to the family, a man, the owner of a business in the area called the Empire House, comes forward and says that he actually saw Loomis along with 2 men, one who they are assuming was Grover, and the other who the paper describes as, quote, a hard character from Fremont. So he comes forward and says that he also saw these individuals in the area as well. So the sheriff's launches basically an interstate manhunt for Arthur Grover in connection with this crime. And he eventually tracks him all the way to Wisconsin. And he finds him there in Wisconsin with Granville Loomis's wagon, his pony, and all of his belongings. So he has everything that G.G. Loomis had. So he is charged, he is found guilty, and he is sentenced to death in the Ohio Penitentiary. And the images there on the left are two images, one from the paper, one from the State Archives collection of Arthur Grover. And then the other picture on the right there is the sheriff on the case, also from the Sentinel. So he, as I said, he is charged and found guilty. Now, Grover's story before and during the trial changes a number of times. He's described as kind of an odd character in the press that comes out around these events. But one thing that does not change is through the whole thing, he maintains that he is innocent. And at his execution, he is reported to have said in a calm and clear voice, quote, "Boys, I die here tonight, an innocent man. Goodbye." So, and what's also interesting is that after that initial quote from the Empire House owner about the hard character from Fremont, that man is never mentioned again. I couldn't find reference to another person ever being sought. We do have to rely mostly at this point on secondhand sources, but I couldn't find anything, at least in this level of my research on him. And also most of what the evidence was against Grover is pretty much what we would call today circumstantial evidence. So I do kind of, while it is a very interesting case of early CSI techniques, I do wonder whether or not today he would have been convicted on what they found. So, all right, but that concludes Granville G. Loomis. We'll move on to our next case. And this is the case of the murder of Olive Peaney from 1895. Excuse me. And this case is one of Wood County's most famous unsolved murders. To this day, the murderer's identity remains unknown. So this story begins on a cool evening on March 1st, 1895 in Tontogany, Ohio. Flip ahead here. So local physician and druggist Dr. Adam Edmond is tallying up the day's take at his drugstore, which this picture here, it's right over on the left there. This is the main intersection, Broad and Main in Tontogany, and it was there on the left. So as he's counting the money, he's startled by what sounds like a gunshot. So he dashes out of his store and over to his home, which is next door, to make sure his wife is okay. And he finds both his wife and the housekeeper, Nellie Hartsing, shaken, but they're not harmed. They're okay. So they're discussing what they heard, what they believe was a gunshot. And while they're discussing this, he notices some lights from the back alley behind the drugstore, and it looks like a fire. So he runs out of the house. He's shouting for help from his neighbor, whose name was Harry Rudd. And they rush off to the back alley to investigate. And they do find what they believe is a burning pile of trash and rags right at the back entrance to Dr. Edmond's office. So they quick grab some pails of water to extinguish the fire. And upon doing so, they discover the real horror. It is not garbage, but in fact, the body of a murdered woman. So they call the police, they begin to investigate the scene, the authorities arrive, they find, and it's the coroner Thomas of Bowling Green and the deputy sheriff Al Farmer who arrive. They investigate and they discover the following. The woman is identified as Olive Peaney, one of Dr. Edmond's patients and also a nearby neighbor and friend. She had been shot and then set on fire. The coroner he determines that death happened pretty much instantaneously from the bullet, which was a .32 caliber. He also discovers that based on the bullet's trajectory, again, early CSI techniques, that the angle indicates that she may have been stooping over or kind of sitting low because of the angle of it. So It appeared to be shot from above. So they then go to her house to inform her husband, because they realize he is not here with the crowd that has gathered. And they actually have to wake him up. He's apparently very hard of hearing, and he didn't even realize that his wife was not in the house. So he said that she retired around 8:30 and they slept in different rooms. So he didn't even know that she was there. So the police go and investigate her room. They see that her bed covers were turned down. It looked like somebody had been sleeping there for a time, but then got up and left. But there were no real disturbances in the room. It didn't look like a struggle had occurred or anything. So they continue their investigation for the weeks leading after this. They discovered that Dr. Edmund and his wife knew Olive and Peter, her husband, Peaney, for about 15 years. And Dr. Edmund was her physician for many years, and he had been treating her for heart problems. And so several neighbors and friends in the area said that she would go to see him at all odd hours. So it really wasn't that unusual that maybe she could have been over at his office at that time, because she did have this heart problem. So sometimes she did go over there at unusual hours. And several witnesses attested that she did have this condition. Now, Mr. Peaney was described by some witnesses as being a very jealous husband, but others said that he was very friendly and very friendly with Dr. Edmund and his wife. They also did discover that Dr. Edmund did carry a revolver for safety reasons. As I said at the beginning, he was, tallying up the day's take. He often carried money back and forth between the store. So he did carry a revolver with him. But the revolver was ruled out in the murder because they said that his was not fired at the time, and it was also the wrong caliber. So things continue forward. And at different times during the investigation, Peter Peaney, Dr. Edmund, Mrs. Edmund, and the Edmunds' housekeeper, Nellie Hartsing, are all charged with the crime. But the charges are all dropped. They then file charges again, a second time, against Dr. and Mrs. Edmund. And Dr. Edmund's trial goes forward first on July 8th of 1895. And kind of in keeping with why the charges were initially dropped, the evidence is not very strong. The prosecutors argue very poorly. The newspaper actually describes it at one point as kind of a circus of a trial. There are conflicting testimonies. There's a lack of credible witnesses. There's just overall insufficient evidence. So the doctor is found not guilty, and they decide that this case has gone so poorly that they decide not to go forward with the prosecution of the wife. So the wife's trial does not happen either. And no one else is ever arrested or investigated for the crime. But there is one other little interesting tidbit with this story. As you can imagine, for many years, rumors swirled in Tuntogany. What happened to Olive Peaney? Many thought it was a love triangle of some sort, but there just never was enough solid evidence. So, as I said, it is still unsolved. But in 1954, Ralph Wires, another resident of Tuntogany, is operating a repair shop out of the same building that was once Dr. Edmund's drugstore. And while he's doing some renovations, he finds a rusty revolver and bullets between the walls of the building. Now, some said at the time that it couldn't have been the murder weapon. Some said it wasn't the same gun that Dr. Edmund owned. Who knows? But it does still seem an odd coincidence. Could it have been the murder weapon? But as I said, the case remains unsolved. Today, Dr. Edmund, the Edmunds and the Peaneys are both buried in Tuntogany Cemetery, less than 40 feet apart. So, all right. So we're going to move on to a couple of a couple of different kinds of cases now. The rest of the cases I'm going to talk about today are actually not murder cases. Well, they're not initially murder cases. There is a murder in one of them, but they're not initially murder cases. And they also move us up in the time frame a little bit to the 20s and 30s, or the era of Prohibition. And Prohibition, along with what it meant, it brought a lot of new crime, and it was also kind of the birth of organized crime. So there's a lot of new things happening in the world of crime at this point. And Wood County certainly saw its share of Prohibition era crime. A couple of background facts to situate us here. Prohibition nationally, we often think of it in 1920, but Wood County actually had Prohibition with the Rose Law that was in 1908. So it was much earlier here in Wood County. And people always ask me, were there speakeasies in Wood County? Well, there probably were. I've never found any definitive evidence, but I'm still looking. But there certainly was a legal sale of alcohol. I found a term frequently used called medicinal or scientific alcohol. And what this was it was kind of a loophole for getting alcohol. So some drugstores and doctors would kind of blur the lines a little bit, and they would prescribe alcohol for certain patients. And it would be a way for people to still be able to get alcohol. And one of the most famous drugstores in Bowling Green's history, Rogers Drugstore, was one of the places that you could get this scientific alcohol. Now, Rogers, as some of you probably know, was a very long-standing business in Bowling Green, operated up until the 1980s. But in the early 1900s, it did have some run-ins with the law. In 1909, it was charged and fined several $100s, which was the maximum fine at the time. And the special counsel was quoted in the newspaper as describing Rogers Drugstore as, quote, one of the vilest saloons ever in Wood County. In 1910, they were arrested again for violating laws, 7 counts of keeping a place where liquor was sold, and 4 against selling it illegally. And then later that same year, Judge Nearing ruled that if they continued to impose the maximum fines, this was going to end Rogers Drug's business. So he believed at the time that Rogers was trying to reform themselves, that they were going to get out of this illegal alcohol business. So they imposed a smaller fine, allowing them to continue to conduct business. But in 1915, once again, charges were filed against selling liquor. And in April of 1917, they really made headlines when a raid was conducted by Sheriff Skibby, in which 29 barrels of liquor plus several other containers were confiscated. And these images here are from the Sentinel, which printed a full list of all of the liquor that they basically confiscated that they considered in excess of medicinal alcohol. And they said that it was up to $3,500 worth of liquor, which today, in today's money, would be over $68,000 worth of liquor. And the judge ordered that it be poured into the sewer, which they did. And there is a small article where they describe that the sheriff and his men poured all of these barrels of liquor into the sewer. I did find other tales as well of this kind of thing, other drugstores and doctors that would occasionally get in trouble for scientific or medicinal alcohol. So this was certainly not the only crime in terms of prohibition. I also came across some smuggling stories of people who were caught moving in the county in different places, moving alcohol throughout the county. But this was kind of one of the most easily documented cases. And then the next two that I'm going to talk about are still the Prohibition era, but they deal more with the organized crime aspect of the Prohibition era. And the first of these is the story of Pretty Boy Floyd and Billy the Killer from 1931. Excuse me. So as I said, Prohibition, along with it, kind of brought the birth of organized crime. And it is a time of a number of bank robberies. They were just thought of, this is also the Depression. So it's kind of, thought of this as easy money, robbing banks. Banks were not set up with the kinds of security that they are today. So both of these last two examples that I'm going to talk about today are these kinds of crimes. So the first one, Pretty Boy Floyd and Billy the Killer, takes place in April of 1931. And for about a week in that month, Bowling Green Police Chief Gallier has been keeping an eye on 4 unusual characters in the Bowling Green area. He's kind of been alerted by local businessmen that there's these 4 people in the area that are acting kind of strange. They're spending a lot of money, and that's always a red flag at this time period. So he thinks they're either trying to pass counterfeit money, or maybe they're casing things out to rob a bank. So at around noon on April 16th, 1931, Paul Crawford, who is working over at Ullman's clothing store, he calls the sheriff. And he says, you know what? These 4 people are back. The women are going back and forth, buying a whole bunch of dresses, and they're going back and forth next door to Lake's barber shop where the 2 men are hanging out. And he said, something doesn't seem right. So Police Chief Gallier calls for assistance from Patrolman Ralph Kastner, who's out in the area, and they start kind of patrolling the main street in the area, and they see the suspect's vehicle over on East Wooster Street, and then they actually eventually spot the individuals making their way down Clough Street. So the police chief and patrolman, they turn down Clough Street slowly, they stop their police cruiser, and they get out, and then they shout to the suspects to stop, that they would like to speak with them. But things do not go as planned. And this is the intersection we're talking about. This is it today, obviously. There erupts basically, as soon as they call out to the suspects, they turn around and they start shooting back at them. And there is a true gangster era shootout at this intersection. Gallier and Kastner obviously open fire back at them. And Kastner, the patrolman, is hit. But he continues to shoot from the ground. And one of the male suspects is shot and killed immediately. One of the female suspects is shot, and she survives. And the second female suspect is captured by Gallier. And the second male suspect escapes and manages to get back to his vehicle. So after all is said and done, they've arrested the people they do have in custody. They begin to kind of construct what's going on here and piece the crime together. Obviously, Officer Kastner is rushed to the hospital because he has been shot. Unfortunately, he does fight for his life for 7 days, but he does not make it. He does die in the hospital. The male suspect that was killed on the scene is eventually identified as William Miller, or Billy the Killer, or Billy the Babyface Killer. Not the same as Babyface Nelson. That's a different gangster with a similar name. Billy the Killer, he has 2 guns on him and $700 also when they take him into custody. Well, take his body into custody. The female suspects are also identified and interrogated. The one woman who was shot, she does survive. And they are eventually identified as Rose and Beulah Baird. And they are known to be associates of both Billy the Killer, but also Pretty Boy Floyd. And Billy the Killer, so all of them are known to be suspects or associates of Pretty Boy Floyd. So they determined that he is likely the other man who escaped. And they did have kind of intel that Billy the Killer and Pretty Boy Floyd were known to be in the area and attempting to rob banks in the area. Both of them had frequented Ohio, and they had actually both not only robbed banks in Ohio, but they had been in Ohio prisons and even escaped Ohio prisons in the past. So after the case, the Baird sisters are returned to Kentucky, where they are held as accomplices to bank robberies down there. They do put out a reward for Pretty Boy Floyd, though that's actually his fingerprint carved by the FBI. And that's the reward that was issued by Sheriff Bruce Pratt for Wood County. So they do put out a reward. There are many rumors that I could find circulating over the next couple of months and years that he, might be in the area. But in 1934, he is finally tracked down and killed in East Liverpool, Ohio. So he never stands for his crimes, but he was killed in Ohio. So, and that takes us actually to our last case. So John Dillinger and Fostoria, Ohio, 1934. So May 3rd, 1934 is generally considered by the locals of the Fostoria area to be the day that John Dillinger robbed the First National Bank in Fostoria. But I did find some conflicting evidence on that. So what I'm going to share with you here is what we do know about this story. So this is an image of, this is the First National Bank in Fostoria, both the interior and exterior image of it. So what we do know is that two gunmen entered the bank right before 3 o'clock. They begin shouting and firing their weapons into the air, basically saying the bank, this is a robbery. And this is right at the time when the bank's time lock, the vault's time lock, opens to take in the day's receipts. So they believe that whoever these guys were, that they were, they must have been casing out the place for a couple days, so that they knew that was going to happen at that point. So Police Chief Frank Culp, he's actually been suspicious that there's been some characters. There's been an unknown car in the area outside the bank a couple of days in a row, and he's been kind of watching things. And so he actually he requests for backup, and because he sees that something's going down. And the bank is actually attached to a larger building where there's a jewelry store on the side. And so he attempts to enter the bank through the side, through the jewelry store. But the gunmen spot him and they open fire on him immediately. And they do hit him, and he kind of collapses and crawls back into the jewelry store. So he doesn't make his way into the bank. There were anywhere from 40 to 50 gunshots that were fired from within inside the bank. 4 other people are injured in the conflict, but amazingly, no one dies. And the gunmen took over $17,000. Now remember, this is 1934, so that's a lot of money at the time. So they get the money, but then they have to think, how are we going to get back out? So they take Bill Daub, who's the second image there, he's a cashier, and Ruth Harris, who I actually didn't have an image of, but she's another worker at the bank. They take them hostage as they're leaving the building, and they basically use them as human shields so that they can't, that the police outside won't open fire on them. And so they take these two and they kind of walk out of the bank up to the car that they have outside, and they get in the car and they make Bill and Ruth stand on the running boards of the car, so basically on the side. And they tell them to hang on, and they're going to take off, and they do. And they take off at 70 miles per hour out of town. And of course, Ruth and Bill are both pleading for their lives that that please don't, let us go. And so eventually they get out of town, and they're continuing to plead for their lives, saying, you know, you've gotten away, you've got to just let us go at this point. So one of the, supposedly, according to Ruth, who does survive this event, she says that they told them, we'll slow down and you jump off. So they do, they slow down and the two jump off the car, and then of course the car speeds away and they get away. And later, Ruth was interviewed by a couple of different newspapers over the years for these events, and she describes that she really believes that one of the men was John Dillinger, and she said that she also feels that why that is. John Dillinger had a reputation of, he didn't like to kill people. He was a criminal. He did rob banks, but he was supposed to be very charismatic, and he really didn't want to hurt anybody that he didn't have to. And she says that the man she believed was John Dillinger, as they were slowing down and telling them to jump off, she said he turned to her and he said, "Thank you." So they thanked them for their assistance with their getaway. They both, Ruth and Bill, were able to walk back into town. They were picked up, I guess, by a truck and taken back into town. So the question remains, was it Dillinger? They did positively identify one of the men there as Homer Van Meter, who was known as an associate of Dillinger. And in addition to both Ruth and Ralph Barber, they both insisted that the other man was Dillinger. They did call the FBI in to analyze fingerprints to identify him, but I honestly couldn't find confirmation that the FBI ever did confirm through fingerprints that it was him. There even in the secondhand accounts of these events, some people say that it may have been Dillinger. Some people say that some historians say it definitely was him. He certainly was wanted for questioning in the crime. He had robbed several other banks in the area around this time. And like I said, he was known for not wanting to take casualties. He was a very charismatic individual. So Ruth's account of him thanking them and, being kind of charismatic, it does line up with that. But like I said, regardless, this has gone down in Wood County's history as a day that most people believe John Dillinger robbed the First National Bank in Fostoria. But he also did not go on to rob many more banks after this. Only a few months later, on July 22nd, 1934, he was gunned down by the FBI in Chicago. So he didn't do much more after that. And he was then obviously never tried or, arrested for this crime in Fostoria. So, wrapping things up. Like I said, I learned from this research that, wow, Wood County really was like the Wild West. There were a lot of different cases that I could have talked about in this. I found so many different things, and I couldn't possibly cover them all. People that have heard me do this talk have said, you got to do a part 2. So we'll see. Maybe someday I will do a part 2. Because as I was doing this research, I found lots of other crimes. Some of them were murders. Some of them were old murders that people discovered in the late 1800s. Lots of other bank robberies other than the ones I talked about today. And sometimes when they did arrest criminals, they would escape and then manhunts would ensue. Sometimes the local law enforcement got in trouble. This one's just for speeding. So he didn't get arrested or anything. And then sometimes the stories, while crimes, were a little bit funny, like the underwear thieves and the goat that escapes. So they weren't all grisly and horrible. But like I said, my impression is that Wood County was a rough place for a while. So I think if I was that underwear thief or that goat, I might get the heck out of here. It's a rough place. So I'd like to thank again the museum for asking me to present today. Like I said, I always enjoy giving this talk, and thank you, and thanks to their sponsors for putting this on.
Thanks, Marnie. That was fascinating. Who knew all those things that took place right here in Wood County? Did anyone have any questions, or do you do questions afterwards if anyone has
Yeah,
any?
if anybody has any questions, feel free. Stop sharing that there.
I have everybody say you can unmute yourself if you'd like to. We had a crime take place, and I'm not very accurate on the facts, but a deputy was shot right at the corner of the library here in North Baltimore. So, yeah.
I'll have to look into that
I
one
think
too.
I think it may have been part of a Dillinger gang at that time too.
Okay.
So, something more to investigate.
All right. Baltimore.
There was another, Marmy, you probably are aware of it, the North Baltimore attorney was murdered in Hoytville. And that's Westenhaver. And in fact, the North Baltimore Historical Society has an excellent small publication about that murder and the trial that goes with it. That turned into a real shootout. Talk about Wild West. That was Wild West.
Yes, yes. That's a great, and I actually, in my original version of this talk, I had that one in here, but it just got so long.
It gets complicated.
I couldn't do them all. So if I ever do a part 2, that one will definitely be in there because that one's a great story.
Marnie, one other little tidbit on the Dillinger and this woman named Ruth that was kidnapped from in Fostoria. That was Ruth Davidson, who some of you may remember. She lived in Bowling Green. She married John Davidson.
Okay.
John was a
So
professor
she
at
wasn't
university.
married yet at the time. That's
No,
why
she
her.
was not
Okay.
married when she was kidnapped. She later married John Davidson. They lived on Troop. He was a professor at the university. I knew John very well through Kiwanis, and they also went to the Presbyterian Church. And Ruth is a very tall, stately, well-dressed lady. And it was interesting to know that she was the Ruth that got kidnapped by supposedly John Dillinger. And she would tell you about it if you asked.
Are you guys gonna do more?
Are we going to do?
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead,
You
no.
probably have some other of these talks scheduled, right?
We do have some more talks coming up, but none of them are quite so astonishing maybe as these. But I don't know. I'm sure, Marissa, you have the list in front of you probably.
Yeah, so next month in July, our talk is going to be over female representation in political buttons from I think 1964 until 2016.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have a couple programs still in the works for August and September. But then in October, we will be talking about kind of like a religious customs thing or a religion that we have here in our museum archives, kind of touching on some of the Bibles and stuff that we have in there. And then in November, we have a program over more things in our archives, just objects that we have. And then in December, we are talking about Title IX sports and kind of female sports in Wood County.
Cool.
Marty,
Yes.
Marty, my husband taught folklore in Fostoria in the 70s, and he had the kids collect folk tales. And I've got copies of the Dillinger stories that they collected.
Oh, wow.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, that's awesome.
Thank you, Marnie. That was very interesting, very good, and enjoyed it very much. I lost the internet about halfway through. So
I
I missed
wondered.
the part about Prohibition, and then I got back in. So.
Well, that's a good way to mention that we have recorded this session. And so in a couple of days, it should be up on our YouTube channel. And we'll share that link with Marissa so you guys can link through that too.
Yeah, and we'll share it on our social media pages, as well as I always send a link out in our weekly e-blasts, our e-newsletters too.
Very cool.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Marnie. Thank you, Marissa. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Unless anyone has any last minute things to share, I think we will end this session and be back then next month. Thank you all. Bye-bye.